want to be honest with you about something. I almost didn't make this video, not because I was afraid of being wrong, because I was afraid of being right. I spent 3 months cross-referencing genealogical records across European royal courts before I understood what I was actually looking at. And when I finally understood it, I sat back from my desk and I didn't move for a long time. Because what I had found wasn't a conspiracy theory, it wasn't a fringe interpretation of disputed evidence, it was a pattern, sitting in plain sight inside the most documented historical record in human history. A pattern that the official narrative has no satisfying explanation for. I didn't set out to question the most documented families in human history. I was doing what I always do, tracing genealogical records, following marriage lines across European royal courts, mapping the connections between the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Tudors, the Bourbons. Standard historical research, the kind that produces nothing more surprising than a footnote. But somewhere around the 3rd month of cross-referencing maternal lineages across the 1700s, I stopped. Because I noticed something. Not an anomaly, not a single missing document, not one suspicious date, a pattern so consistent, so precise, so deliberate in its repetition across multiple countries, multiple centuries, and multiple dynasties that once I saw it, I couldn't look away. And I have been trying to explain it ever since. What I am about to show you is not a theory. It is a series of questions that the official historical record refuses to answer. And the more I looked, and the more I realized that the silence itself was the answer. Stay with me, because once you see this, you can't unsee it. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something directly. If what I show you in this video changes the way you think about the history you were taught, about the families who have governed this world for centuries, about what was erased and what was preserved and why, will you share it with one person who needs to see it? That is all I ask. Not because I need the views, because this kind of information travels or it disappears, and the people whose story I am about to tell you are counting on it disappearing. Now, let's begin. Start with a simple exercise. Pull up any major European royal family tree from the 18th or 19th century. Anyone you like. The Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the House of Hanover, the Bourbons. And now follow the paternal lines. Father to son, king to prince, dynasty to dynasty. You will find meticulous documentation, birth certificates, succession records, court announcements stretching back generations. The paper trail is immaculate. Now follow the maternal lines. Follow the women. Ask yourself where these queens, these empresses, these royal brides actually came from before they married into the most documented families in human history. The official answer is always the same. Minor nobility, distant cousins, princesses from German principalities so small they barely warranted a dot on contemporary maps. Obscure houses from territories most people today couldn't locate without searching for 20 minutes. Before we dive deeper, if you are new here, consider subscribing before this video is over. And not every channel will touch what I'm about to touch. The ones that do tend not to repeat it. I want you to be here when the next piece of this investigation is ready, and stay until the end of this video, not as a favor to me, because the final 10 minutes contain the evidence that ties everything together. The part that made me sit back from my desk and stare at the wall. If you leave before that, you will have seen the pieces but not the picture. Fine, that is plausible. Royal families married strategically. Small alliances mattered. But here is where it stops being plausible. When you try to trace these women's own ancestry, not their husband's ancestry, their own, back just 2 or 3 generations, something happens. The documentation doesn't become incomplete. It becomes sparse. Not incomplete, sparse. There is a difference. Incomplete means records were lost, damaged, never created. Sparse means records exist, but only from a certain point forward. As if these women's histories began the exact moment they became useful to someone else's narrative. Think about what that means. These are women marrying into families that track bloodlines with the obsession of a modern pharmaceutical company tracking clinical trials. Families that commissioned entire genealogical departments. Families whose legitimacy to rule entire continents depended on unbroken bloodline documentation, stretching back as far as the documents could reach. And yet, bride after bride, century after century, the same pattern repeats. Wives of kings appear with minimal lineage documentation. Their origins become accepted. No one asks, no one verifies. The sparse records are treated as sufficient because questioning them would mean questioning the legitimacy of the king they married. And no one with power questions the legitimacy of power. The silence was deafening. This raises one simple but critical question. If these royal houses were so obsessed with bloodline purity that they tracked a stable boy's ancestry before letting him near their horses, why would they accept queens whose ancestry couldn't be traced with certainty? There are only two possible answers. Either the genealogical standards that applied to everyone else somehow didn't apply to these specific women, or their ancestry was traceable, and someone decided it shouldn't be. Now, I want to pause here because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking that this could just be normal historical record loss. Documents decay, fires happen, scribes make errors. And you are right that all of those things happen. But keep watching, because what I am about to show you is not one gap in one document in one country. It is the same gap appearing in the same place across multiple dynasties, in multiple countries, across multiple centuries. And that is not document decay. That is a pattern, and patterns have authors. Also, before we go deeper, if you have not already hit the like button, do it now. Not for the algorithm, though it does help this investigation reach more people. Do it because what you are about to see in the next 20 minutes will make you wish you had done it at the start. Look at the Romanovs. The official history gives us a clean narrative. The Romanov dynasty descended from the Rurik line, an unbroken succession stretching back to the 9th century. Russia's founding royal family, legitimized through centuries of documented rule. Except when you go into the actual genealogical records, not the summary documents, the primary records, you find transitions that feel managed, constructed. The documentation exists certainly, marriage certificates, birth records, court announcements. The paperwork is all there, but the paperwork and the bloodline are not the same thing. A document can say whatever the person writing it needs it to say. A bloodline tells a different kind of truth. And buried in academic literature, not in popular history books, in footnotes, in the kind of academic whispers that get mentioned once and never expanded upon, because expanding upon them leads somewhere the institution is not prepared to go. There are references to something interesting. Tatar ancestry, not Mongolian, Tatar. The distinction matters more than it might seem, because the word Tatar, if you follow its linguistic roots, trace its etymology, examine how European scholars used it across 4 centuries of documentation, you find that it is a derivative, a linguistic cousin to a name that, for reasons I want you to think carefully about, is almost never spoken directly in mainstream historical circles. Tartaria. I will say that again because I want you to hear it clearly. Tartaria. A name on maps, a territory, a label that once covered an area larger than any empire in human history, and a word that serious academic historians treat with a level of discomfort that itself tells you something. Because discomfort is not a neutral reaction. Discomfort is what happens when a question gets too close to something that was not supposed to be found. We will come back to that name. Because it is the thread that once you pull it, unravels everything. And pulling it starts with something you can check yourself in the next 10 minutes. Now look westward, the British royal family. In 1714, the British crown passed to the House of Hanover. German royals imported from the Principality of Hanover to solve a succession crisis. The official explanation is straightforward: Protestant succession, parliamentary approval, legitimate claim through distant steward ancestry, all documented, all proper, all clean. Except when you examine where the House of Hanover itself came from, you find something peculiar. Many of the small German principalities that provided Britain, and later other European crowns, with their new royal families had themselves undergone recent dynastic changes. New families, new names, new heraldic crests. all within a generation or two of being called upon to supply monarchs for larger kingdoms. Think about the timing carefully. A small German principality undergoes a quiet dynastic transition. A new family takes over. One generation passes. Suddenly that family is being proposed as the legitimate heir to the British throne, one of the most scrutinized royal successions in European history, and the scrutiny stops at the principality's door. No one looks deeper. No one asks where that family came from before it governed a territory so small it barely appears on the maps of the era. The question is not asked, and an unasked question leaves no record of having been suppressed. Now I want to acknowledge something before we go further. Maybe I am seeing patterns in randomness. Maybe these genealogical gaps are simply what happens to documentation across centuries. Paper decays, records burn, scribes make errors. Oh, history is full of genuine gaps that have innocent explanations, and I have considered every one of them seriously. I am not someone who dismisses conventional explanations without engaging with them first. And then I started looking at the buildings, not the castles these families inherited, the buildings they constructed during their consolidation of power, the ones they chose to build, the ones they paid for, the ones that were supposed to announce to the world exactly who they were and where they came from. If you want to know what a family believes about itself, do not read its official genealogy. Look at what it builds when it has unlimited resources and complete creative control. St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace, London, Buckingham Palace's major renovation phases, Vienna, the Schönbrunn Palace expansions, Madrid, the Royal Palace is constructed after the 1734 fire that conveniently destroyed the previous Habsburg residence along with its records. We will return to those convenient fires shortly. Official history tells us these buildings share stylistic elements because of neoclassical revival. Baroque influence, the spread of Palladian architectural principles across educated European society. Architects traveled, ideas spread, styles were fashionable, reasonable explanation on the surface. Except these buildings do not just share stylistic choices, they share specific technical systems, construction methods that require the same foundational engineering knowledge to execute correctly. Proportion systems, the mathematical relationship between a building's height, width, depth, and the placement of every opening within it. That repeat with a precision that goes far beyond aesthetic fashion or the influence of a published architectural treatise. These are engineering decisions. Decisions that require specific transmitted knowledge to implement correctly at massive scale. The kind of knowledge you do not absorb from reading a book. The kind of knowledge you receive from someone who already knows. A teacher, a tradition, a shared institutional memory that exists independent of any single architect's published work. So I started asking about the architects. Different names in different countries, certainly. Rastrelli in St. Petersburg, Nash in London, Fischer von Erlach in Vienna. But where did they train? Who taught them to build at this scale with this specific mathematical precision? Follow that question in each case, and the trail goes cold. Not everywhere, not at the beginning, just at the critical points, just precisely where the transmission of knowledge would have occurred, as if the origin of the knowledge was the one thing about these men that needed to remain unspecified. Now here is the detail I keep returning to. Most of these buildings were constructed or significantly modified during the same narrow window of time. The early to mid-1700s, the exact same period, and I need you to hold this thought as we continue, or the exact same period when something very large was disappearing from European maps, and new dynasties with their suspiciously recent genealogies were appearing in the space that something else had occupied. But before we get to the maps, I need you to go somewhere specific. Go to Vienna, pull up images of the Schönbrunn Palace facade. Study the proportions, the relationship between the building's height and its width, the placement of the windows relative to the total wall surface, the mathematical logic governing where every element sits in relation to every other element. Take a screenshot if you want, hold it in your mind. Now go to St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace, do the same thing. Study the proportions, the mathematical relationships, the engineering logic embedded in the facade. Notice how it feels, not just how it looks. How the scale of the entrance relates to the building behind it. How the repetition of elements creates a specific psychological effect on the person standing before it. Now, Beijing, the outer ceremonial buildings of the Forbidden City. What do you notice? Not similar architectural styles. I am not talking about similar. The exact same proportion systems, the same mathematical relationship between facade height and facade width, the same ratios governing window placement relative to total wall surface, the same principles determining the relationship between entrance scale and building mass behind it, the same psychological engineering, because that is what it is, designed to make the person standing before it feel a specific thing about the power residing inside. This is not aesthetic similarity. This is a mathematical system, specific, a technical, requiring training and transmitted knowledge to implement correctly at large scale. And it appears with unsettling precision in the capital buildings of dynasties that the official record describes as rivals, as separate civilizations, as peoples with minimal contact and competing interests. The official history tells us these similarities are explained by traveling architects, by shared aesthetic trends, by the influence of Palladio and other classical masters whose published works circulated across educated European society. Reasonable on the surface, but that explanation requires architects from rival empires to independently adopt not just similar styles, but identical engineering mathematics, and then implement those identical systems simultaneously in multiple capitals across thousands of miles, and all while their patron families were allegedly competing for supremacy over each other. Or, and I am just asking the question, were they not actually rivals? Were these separate royal families actually branches of the same ancestral tree, building in a common architectural language because that language represented a shared heritage they all understood, but none of them could acknowledge in public? The architecture was not the declaration of who they were. It was the memory of what they came from, built in stone because stone lasts longer than documents. And documents, as we are about to see, have a way of burning. Let us talk about maps, because maps do not lie the way words can lie. Words can be reframed, reinterpreted, translated with convenient ambiguity. A word that meant one thing in the 1650 can be explained to mean something else entirely by 1850 if the people doing the explaining hold institutional authority. Maps are different. Maps show what was known, what was believed, what existed in the minds of the most rigorous empirical observers of their era. You cannot reframe a map without drawing a new one. And when the new maps arrive, the old ones become evidence of what was replaced. Go find maps of Asia from the 1600s and 1700s. These are not hard to find. They are digitized, publicly available in the collections of major universities and libraries around the world. French maps, Dutch maps, British maps, German maps. Look at the vast interior of the Eurasian landmass. What do you find? Tartary, Grand Tartary, Tartaria. Not a small region, not a footnote, not a vague label applied to unexplored wilderness by cartographers who didn't know what else to write. An enormous territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia in the north to the frontiers of China and India in the south. Larger than the Roman Empire at its peak, larger than any European kingdom, one of the largest labeled territories on any map produced in human history, and labeled not with uncertainty, but with the same confidence applied to France, or England, or the Ottoman Empire. And here's what stops being easy to explain. These were not speculative maps. These were not the decorative fantasy cartography of the early Renaissance where mapmakers filled blank spaces with sea monsters and imaginary kingdoms to hide their ignorance. These were trade maps, military maps, maps commissioned by merchants who staked their capital on the accuracy of the routes shown, maps commissioned by generals who staked their armies on the accuracy of the territories depicted. These cartographers' professional reputations, and sometimes their lives, depended on getting it right. A merchant who followed a wrong route lost his cargo. A general who trusted a wrong map lost his army. There was no room for creative speculation. And on these maps, you will find something that the official explanation struggles to account for. Symbols indicating cities with stone buildings, trade routes connecting them to each other and to the known world. And yes, royal courts. Multiple royal courts distributed across the Tartarian territory, not scattered at the edges, but deep in the interior, so in positions that suggest governmental centers of a functioning civilization. Not a collection of wandering nomadic tribes herding across empty steppe. An organized civilization with governmental structures, with urban centers, with the infrastructure of a society operating at continental scale. And then, over the course of roughly 70 years, between approximately 1750 and 1820, it disappears from the maps. Not gradually in the way that information accumulates and boundaries shift. It disappears. The western portion becomes Russia, the eastern portion becomes Qing China, the central portions become Ottoman territory, or become labeled simply as wilderness, or become nothing at all on the maps that follow. The territory that 3 generations of the world's most rigorous cartographers labeled, detailed, and staked their reputations on simply ceases to exist in the official geographical record. And the question I cannot stop asking is this: where did the people go? Not the land. The land we can watch get redistributed on maps. That part is visible and traceable. The people, the royal courts, the urban populations, the governmental structures that European cartographers considered significant enough to mark with symbols on maps that kings and generals depended on. Where did they go? Not as a rhetorical question, as a historical question that demands an answer and has not received one. Here is what bothers me most about the official explanation for all of this. When empires fall, we have records, we have transition periods, we have the documentation of collapse because the people experiencing collapse are motivated to record it. They are losing something and they want the world to know what they lost. Rome did not vanish overnight. We have centuries of its decline meticulously recorded. Every treaty, every military defeat, every territorial loss is documented in extraordinary detail. Gibbon wrote 6 volumes about it. The documentation of Rome's end is itself a monument. The Byzantine Empire left volumes of historical testimony about its final days. We know the names of the generals at Constantinople's fall. We know the exact date. We know what the last emperor said before the walls were breached. We know who died defending which gate. The Mongol Empire's fragmentation into successor khanates, one of the most complex imperial dissolutions in history, is thoroughly documented. We have the succession disputes, the civil wars, plus the exact territories that different claimants controlled year by year as the great empire came apart. Even the smallest political entities left records of their endings. When the Venetian Republic fell in the 1797, we have the exact vote count of the final Senate session that dissolved it. 512 in favor of dissolution, 20 opposed, 5 abstentions. We know how individual senators voted. We know what was said in the chamber. We know who wept and who didn't. The Venetian Republic documented its own death with the same meticulous care it had applied to everything else. But Tartaria, if it existed as these maps suggest, as these cartographers insisted, as European merchants and generals required it to exist in order to conduct their business, we should have something. Treaties of dissolution, succession disputes, refugee populations seeking asylum in neighboring territories, resistance movements leaving behind manifestos and martyr stories, the literary tradition of a people processing the trauma of loss, something that civilizations leave behind when they end, because ending is the most significant thing a civilization can do, and human beings record significant things. Instead, we get silence. And into that silence, we get new royal families with recently assembled genealogies, claiming territories that maps from one generation earlier labeled as Tartarian. The official explanation for all of this is that Tartaria was simply a catch-all term, a geographical label applied by European cartographers to the vast unknown interior of Asia. Not a real political entity, just a word for empty space that educated Europeans used when they didn't know what else to write. The maps look detailed because cartographers filled in details to appear more knowledgeable than they were. The royal courts indicated on the maps were speculation, not documentation. But that explanation requires us to believe something extraordinary. It requires us to believe that European cartographers, the same cartographers who accurately mapped coastlines that modern satellite imagery confirms to within meters, the same cartographers whose trade route documentation was precise enough that merchants built entire business empires on it, suddenly became vague and imprecise and actively dishonest exclusively when mapping the largest single landmass on their maps. That they drew specific borders, marked specific cities, indicated specific royal courts with specific symbols, all for something they knew didn't actually exist as a cohesive political entity, that they fabricated the largest feature on their maps while getting everything else right. Does that make sense to you? Because it does not make sense to me. And the more I looked, the less sense it made. And the less sense it made, the more I needed to understand why the official explanation requires us to believe something that should be obviously unreasonable. Now here is where this investigation stops being a purely historical question and becomes something we could actually answer with tools we already possess today. We have genetic testing. We can now trace human ancestry through DNA with a precision that would have seemed miraculous 50 years ago. We can identify migration patterns from thousands of years ago. We can confirm or refute genealogical claims that once depended entirely on documentary evidence that could be written, edited, burned, and rewritten. The technology exists. It is accessible. It is being used constantly by universities, by private companies, by ordinary individuals curious about their own origins. So here is a simple question that I cannot find a satisfying answer to. Why has there never been a comprehensive genetic study of European royal families? Not the claimed ancestry, not the genealogical trees they commission historians to authenticate and frame for palace corridors. The actual genetic heritage, the DNA. The biological reality underneath the documents that can be neither burned nor rewritten. Some studies exist certainly, small ones, targeted ones, usually focused on confirming a specific historical claim that is already politically convenient. A few Romanov remains identified and matched after 1991. Richard III's genome mapped from skeletal remains found beneath a parking lot. Always specific, always limited, always pointing somewhere the families are already comfortable pointing, but never a complete, comprehensive mapping of royal bloodlines using modern genetic techniques. Never the full picture, never the study that would answer the question definitively and permanently. And think about that for a moment. These are families whose entire claim to power rests on their bloodlines. Families who commission detailed studies of their artwork, their architecture, their archival records, their ancestral residences, their correspondence, their furniture. Families who have the resources, the institutional access, and the stated historical interest to pursue any question they choose to pursue. Families who have spent centuries obsessed with documenting and proving their legitimacy in every other conceivable domain. And they have shown remarkable, consistent, sustained disinterest in genetically verifying the one thing their authority is supposed to rest upon. Consider what modern genetic testing has already revealed about ancient populations we once thought we understood completely, where groups we believed were isolated and genetically homogeneous turn out to be deeply mixed. Genetic markers from continents away appearing in populations that supposedly had no contact with those regions for thousands of years. The genetic reality of human history is that pure bloodlines do not exist and never existed. We are all the product of mixing and migration and connections our written history simply forgot or chose not to record. So what would a comprehensive genetic study of European royalty actually show? What markers might emerge that do not match the genealogical charts hanging in palace libraries? What Central Asian signatures might appear in families claiming pure Germanic descent? What Siberian genetic lineages might surface in bloodlines that the official record traces only to Western Europe? What would the DNA of the British royal family show about the House of Hanover's actual origins before it was called upon to provide Britain with its monarchs? I am not telling you the answer. I am asking why no one with the power and the resources to find the answer permanently has chosen to look for it, unless they already know what looking would find. And if that is true, then every time one of these families appears on your television screen, at a coronation, at a state funeral, at a public ceremony, you are watching people perform a genealogical story they know to be incomplete. The question is whether we remain the audience for that performance, or whether we become the people who finally ask what the performance is hiding. Now look at the symbols. Royal heraldry. The visual language these families chose to represent their identity and legitimacy to the world. If the genealogical documents can be forged and the architectural connections can be explained away as coincidence, the heraldic symbols are harder to dismiss because symbols are chosen deliberately, maintained deliberately, and passed down with deliberate care across generations. A family's heraldic choices tell you what that family believes about itself at the deepest level. Start with the double-headed eagle. It appears in the heraldry of the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, multiple Balkan nations, various German principalities spread across Central Europe. We are told this symbol was adopted and independently readopted across these cultures, each time carrying different symbolic meaning in its new context. In different families, different empires, different centuries, all independently arriving at the same complex symbol. But the double-headed eagle is not a simple symbol. It is a technically complex image requiring specific artistic tradition and knowledge to render correctly. The posture of both heads, the angle of the gaze, the positioning of the wings, the relationship between the two facing directions, and the single unified body beneath them. The specific crown types placed above each head. This is not a symbol that emerges randomly in disconnected cultures who happen to think of the same complex idea independently. This is a symbol that gets transmitted, deliberately, through connected networks of people who share a common visual vocabulary and a common understanding of what the symbol means and why it matters. And it appears in its specific correct form across royal houses that supposedly had limited contact during the exact periods when it was being adopted into their heraldry. All of those things, simultaneously, coincidentally, without any connecting explanation beyond the passage of time and the natural imperfection of historical record-keeping. Does that explanation seem simpler to you than the alternative? Because here is the alternative. What if the royal families we are told are separate lineages are actually branches of a single ancestral tree? What if Tartaria was not a vague geographical term, but a civilization, continental in scale, sophisticated in organization, capable of building cities across Siberia and palace complexes across 2 continents in a unified architectural language? What if the descendants of that civilization still govern, not under the old name, under new names, new genealogies, or new official histories assembled in the decades after their old civilization disappeared from maps and the records of its existence began to burn? What if history is not what happened? What if history is what the people who controlled the records agreed to say happened? I do not have the final answer. I want to be genuinely honest about that. Not as a rhetorical disclaimer designed to make everything I have said sound more credible, but as an actual statement of where this investigation stands. I have questions that multiply the deeper I look. I have anomalies that do not resolve into the official explanation, no matter how generously I apply it. I have patterns that appeared when I was not looking for them and that I cannot make disappear by looking away. What I have given you today are not conclusions. They are starting points. The next time you stand in front of a European palace, ask yourself who decided what mathematics would govern its construction, and where they learned that mathematics, and who else learned it at the same time and used it to build strikingly similar structures in capitals thousands of miles away. The next time you encounter a royal family tree, follow the maternal lines. Ask where the women came from. Ask why their histories begin the moment they became dynastically useful and grow sparse the moment you try to trace them backward into the generations that should be there. The next time you open a historical atlas, find a map from 1700. Find the label that covers a territory larger than any empire in human history, and ask yourself what replaced it and how, and why the replacement left no record of the transition that even the smallest political entities in history managed to leave behind. Ask yourself why the genealogical documentation stops at exactly the point where it would reveal something important about actual origins. Why the maps changed so completely in such a compressed period of time. Why the architecture speaks a mathematical language that the official history refuses to translate. Why the fires occur at exactly the moments when old records and new narratives are about to collide. Why the genetic studies that would settle these questions permanently remain undone by the families most invested in their own legitimacy. The next time you see a royal family on your screen, at a coronation, at a state ceremony, or at a public appearance that is designed to remind you of their ancient and unbroken legitimacy, you will notice something you cannot explain away. You will see the performance. And once you see the performance, you begin to ask what it is performing in place of. The deeper I went into this investigation, the more I understood that what we call history might simply be the story that the people who controlled the records agreed to tell. And somewhere in the gaps, in the missing maternal genealogies, in the fires and the silences and the unasked genetic questions, in the mathematical systems encoded in stone across 2 continents, in the maps that showed something vast where our history insists there was nothing, there is another story. A story about who we actually inherited this world from. A story about what was lost or hidden or deliberately forgotten by people who needed the old story replaced with a new one before anyone thought to ask for the original. A story we are not supposed to remember. But here is what I know after going as deep into this as I have gone. You have seen the patterns now. You have followed the maternal lines. You have looked at the maps. You have noticed the architecture. You have asked why the silence falls at exactly the same points across every separate category of evidence: genealogical, architectural, cartographic, genetic, linguistic, and why those silences align with each other in ways that coincidence cannot comfortably explain. If this investigation changed the way you think about the history you were taught, share this video with one person tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Because the information that challenges official narratives has a way of becoming harder to find over time. And the people whose story this actually is are counting on the silence holding. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now. The next part of this investigation goes deeper, into the specific documents, into the architectural measurements, into the genetic studies that do exist, and what they quietly revealed before the conversation moved on. You do not want to miss what comes next, and you will not see it anywhere else. Leave a comment below with the single thing in this video that stopped you, the moment where the pattern became undeniable. I read every comment, and your response to this investigation shapes where it goes next. And the history we inherited may not be the history that happened, but the people asking the questions are the ones who eventually find out.